Hello, everybody, and delighted to be with you today. I'm finding the camera. There we are. I'm in Holton. I'm a faculty member at George Mason University at the Schar School of Policy and Government, and I'm also appointed at the College of Education and Human Development, and I teach education policy. And I'm delighted to be doing this sample class today. I do teach education policy, as I said, and I tend to teach classes around, K-12 education policy and or higher ed policy, but lots and lots of topics that circle around our topic today, which is what to do about our teacher race gap. So I'm thrilled to get to talk with you all today. We have a very special guest, and I'm going to treat this like I do my normal class, which is when I'm teaching, I often bring in experts in the field. I've brought in congressmen, an occasional senator. I recently had the CEO of Ed Trust, a really terrific think tank here in town, advocacy organization. So I love to have guests come make themselves available to my students. And what I do when I have guests in my classes is I really mean to have it be an opportunity for students to ask them questions, but I, as the faculty member, reserve the right to go first. So I'm going to introduce myself just a little tiny bit more, and then I'm going to ask our special guest to introduce himself a little bit more, and then I'll get to ask him some questions, and then I'll open it up to the audience to ask questions. So be thinking about what you want to ask, because this is not meant to be a one-way. Even though you're not here with us in the room, this is not meant to be one way. It's meant to be a conversation. So both between me and Dr. Steinberg, but also with you. So as I said at the beginning, I'm Ann Holton, a faculty member here at George Mason. I came to academia fairly late in life, having been a policy practitioner with a number of different hats along the way. I've had so many careers, it's not worth listing them all, but I would say my policy careers really started when I was the first lady of Virginia when my husband, Tim Kaine, was governor, and I helped reform Virginia's foster care system. And then I served as Secretary of Education in Virginia for several years. And then I came to Mason and the faculty. And then I had a year of serving as Mason's interim president in the year that entered the pandemic. So I say it was dog years. It was 1 year, but it felt like 7. And that qualified me to teach higher ed policy along with the K-12 policy I'd been teaching all along. All that to say, I bring very much a practitioner's perspective to my classes. And I love the fact that here at Mason, we have folks with all kinds of different perspectives. And today, I'm so thrilled you, class, are going to have the opportunity to hear from one of my colleagues here at Mason, who is really a top nationally recognized expert researcher in education policy, Matthew Steinberg.
It's great to be here with you, Ann, and virtually with folks online. This is my 3rd year here at George Mason. I'm an associate professor of education and public policy, like Ann, jointly in the public policy school here at Schar and the College of Education and Human Development. I was trained as an applied economist. I also direct our Ed Policy Research Center, which is called Ed Policy Forward, which I'm sure we might talk a little bit about the work that faculty here at Mason are doing around ed policy issues. And I'm excited to talk through this topic. I teach a course actually right now called Teacher Development and Education Policy, where we cover all of the issues around teacher pipeline, teacher recruitment, teacher evaluation, teacher professional development that we'll likely be talking a little bit about today. And again, welcoming your questions around teacher policy across the experience and pipeline distribution of teachers.
So that reminds me, thank you, Matthew, and so we're just really going to have fun talking today and hope you all can join in with us. But that reminds me, before I start on my questions, to say we would love to have your questions and how to do your questions. So you have 2 options. You can raise your virtual hand, and our handy dandy tech guy here, who happens to be Paul Nooney, the Director of Student Services and Recruitment here at the Schar School, will in turn will unmute you and allow you to ask your question out loud, or if you prefer, you can type questions into the chat and feel free to do that at any point, but at some point we'll pause and start taking, as I say, I get to go first, but you'll get your turn at questions at least by the midpoint of the hour, if not before. With that, those ground rules, let's get started.
Yeah.
Matthew, tell us first, what is the teacher race gap? And what do we mean by that term?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first we're talking about teachers by racial and ethnic characteristics, right? And there's a few dimensions along the teacher pipeline in which a gap in teacher outcomes can occur. First, we think about recruitment and hiring, right? Nationally, we have effectively at this point in our K-12 public school system, a majority minority population, right? We have
In the student,
in the K-12 student population, right? So more than 50% of students in K-12 public schools, about 50+ million of those students are non-white. But notably, less than a quarter of our teachers nationally are non-white. And we think about, well, how is that? And again, we'll talk a little bit today about, the key issues around recruitment and hiring, right? One of the things that some scholars of teacher policy, especially around teacher race, people like Constance Lindsay, who's at UNC Chapel Hill, have identified is that there tends to be a stopgap in the bachelor's degree attainment, right? One of the things that we find, we know that teachers need to have bachelor's degrees in order to be credentialed and eligible to teach. And one of the things that scholars like Constance Lindsay and others have shown is that we have significant differences in college attainment by race, right? So her work
for all the obvious reasons, including the wealth gap.
the
right?
wealth
The
gap,
racial wealth
right? So there's economic inequality that certainly drives differential attainment for college, right? And the rates that Lindsay reports going back to 2015 are that among whites, about 40% have college degrees. Among Asians, about 65% have college degrees. Now, when we look at Black students, only about 21% have college degrees, and Hispanic, Latinx students have about 16% of them have, right? So when we think about, one of the key barriers to entry into the teaching profession, right, it is the fact that we've got significant differences in terms of college attainment.
Yeah. So that's getting to the causes, but just to be sure that we understand what the gap, when we talk about the gap, we're talking about that difference between the population, the racial distribution of the student population and the teacher population.
Exactly.
Why does that difference matter?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there's been an emergent literature in education policy and in the economics of education that looks at the academic and non-academic consequences for minority students of having a minority teacher of the same race in the early elementary grades. And this scholarship has grown in the last 4 or 5 years and has looked at, again, this is known as sort of student teacher race matching. And what the evidence shows is that, particularly for Black students in the early elementary grades, if those students have at least one of their teachers who are Black also, their academic achievement goes up, they receive fewer disciplinary referrals, they've got better longer term outcomes, including college attainment, high school graduation, and later labor market outcomes. So, on the one hand, as you've identified, we've got this sort of, differential in the rates of, K-12 students by race and K-12 teachers by race. And the implications are important given, again, this literature that shows that students who are exposed to same race teachers benefit.
They benefit in all kinds of ways, both academically and beyond.
Exactly.
And we can think about what the mechanisms for that are. Some of them obvious, having a role model opportunity, but also having folks who are culturally competent in understanding the students' needs, et cetera. But the bottom line is, it does matter that we have a big gap, and it matters to students.
It's not just about the teacher workforce reflecting the observable characteristics of the students, right? It's in fact that those characteristics and exposure to same race teachers has real positive benefits for students, particularly in the early elementary grades.
Especially, okay, early elementary, interesting. So so that's what the gap is and a little bit about why it matters. What does the research tell us about how we've gotten to this point? You've talked already about the difference in college attainment. Are there other factors that help us, that have gotten us to the point where we have such a differential?
Yeah, it's a great question. So not only is it about differences in college attainment, but even on the job, right? We know that teachers of color, minority teachers disproportionately teach in some of our most difficult schools in terms of the characteristics of those schools being those that serve significantly poor students, right? Who enter school as a result of the economic issues that you mentioned in the community, in the neighborhood, who are, typically 1, 2, 3 grade levels behind. So their academic achievement is also lagging. And as a result of the systematic sorting of Black teachers to these more disadvantaged schools, those teachers are also more likely to leave, right? That the exit rates, teacher turnover tends to be systematically and significantly higher in those school settings than in more affluent school settings. So when we look at the patterns of teacher, the distribution of teachers by race across schools and school settings, right? Black teachers are ending up in these, again, harder to staff schools serving more disadvantaged kids, and therefore also
high
likely
stress environments and
exactly
environments where you don't necessarily feel all that supported. You
Right.
might even be getting paid less, et cetera, et cetera.
right.
Yeah.
So think about sort of geographically
Yeah.
places like DC, Southeast DC compared to Northwest DC, or Chicago, where I went to grad school, South side of Chicago, serves very different kids in terms of their economic characteristics than the North side.
So, as you know, I serve on the Virginia Board of Education, and we've looked at some of our teacher shortage issues in Virginia, and the teachers of color shortage is just one part of a bigger shortage issue. But I know when we first started looking at this issue, we all assumed that, oh, well, the problem is all about how do you recruit teachers. And when you look under the hood, evidence is, teacher recruitment matters, the pipeline matters, but also retention matters hugely. And that there's a differential in retention for African-American teachers versus or teachers of color versus white teachers.
Especially because those teachers of color are teaching in our most difficult to staff schools with,
Right.
like you said, less supportive
Right.
environments in terms of leadership and resources, right? We know that, resource differentials, funding, differs dramatically in urban schools compared to more affluent non-urban school environments.
Well, and it's, and I've had the opportunity to visit many of those disadvantaged schools during my time as Secretary of Education, otherwise. And you, I think, started out as a teacher. Am I right?
In New York
and
City.
working in a high poverty
That's
community.
correct. Yeah.
And so, from your classroom experience, I know from my opportunities to watch those, and it's just a high stress environment under any circumstance. And everything we've done over the last several decades, really, to try to increase accountability so as to improve student outcomes, no matter how positive the efforts were, they've just piled stress on top of stress.
And I think
those communities,
that's exactly right. And you mentioned accountability, and one aspect of accountability in education that's grown dramatically in its rigor and intensity over the last decade, post Race to the Top, are teacher evaluation systems.
Yep.
And as many might know, the predominant measure of teacher performance in these evaluation systems are subjective, more or less subjective appraisals of teacher practice by administrators, classroom observations of teacher performance.
Right. So, and we're getting into your research, but within the teacher evaluation space, there's some kind of student success component, some testing component. There's been a lot of controversy on that, but you're saying that the biggest part of teacher evaluation is actually some kind of teacher observation.
Right. So if you look nationwide across state and district evaluation systems, every teacher in the United States is evaluated based on classroom observations, right? And in many cases, the overwhelming majority, if not the entirety of their evaluation ratings, depend on classroom observations. So yes, it's true that one of the policy changes in the wake of Race to the Top in the context of accountability and evaluation of teachers was linking teacher performance to scores. Yeah. But nationally, we can do that for only about a third of our teachers, right? Because only about a third of our teachers nationally teach in tested grades and subjects. So subjects in which we have state accountability exams, right? 3rd through 8th grade. Okay. So really, we can only construct teacher value-added measures, right? These measures based on student achievement growth for teachers in grades 4 through 8 who teach math or English language arts, for example, which is only about a third of the teachers, which means that every teacher is rated on classroom observations. But what we find in districts throughout the country, and I've done work in Chicago on this, is that those classroom observation scores reflect aspects of the classroom that have nothing to do with teachers' actual instructional performance. Things like the level of poverty in the classroom, the incoming academic achievement of the teacher's students.
So let's do this.
Yeah.
So this is getting into some of your
Yeah.
current research in Chicago. Tell us more. What have you been studying and what have you found?
Yep. So when we just look at, pardon me, average observation scores, classroom observation scores in the context of these evaluation systems in places like Chicago, which I've studied, if you were to line up teachers based on their observation scores, the typical white teacher would be at the 55th percentile. So if out of 100 teachers, the average white teacher is number 55.
Above average.
Above average.
Right.
The average Black teacher is at the 37th percentile in Chicago.
Well below average.
Well below average.
Yep.
So looking at this data, I asked the question, well, what explains this gap?
Yeah.
Right? Is it something about teacher performance? Is it something about the context in which teachers teach, knowing what we've just described, which is that we have differential patterns by which teachers are sorted and distributed across schools serving different student populations? And so I asked the question, what explains this race gap in teacher performance ratings? And what we find is that almost all of the differences in teacher performance on these classroom observation scores by race has to do with differences in the school and classroom context in which teachers teach, right? So to put a finer point on it, the mere fact that and importantly, it's not about differences in instructional effectiveness based on student achievement scores.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not the case that Black teachers are less effective in raising student achievement than their white peers.
And it's not necessarily some kind of intentional or unintentional discrimination.
We don't find that either.
It's not so much that that the evaluators are prejudiced against the African-American teachers, but rather that who the students those teachers are teaching is controlling the outcome of the observations.
So so exactly right. So what we show is that if you account for differences in the composition of a teacher's classroom, so the share of their students who are poor, the prior achievement of the students, so if they have lower achieving students, their misconduct rates, for example, which are highly correlated with poverty and achievement. And if we control for those, if we account for those statistically, the average performance between Black and white teachers goes away.
Is that right? Completely.
Yes.
So the simplistic view might be, oh, the Black teachers aren't as good as the white teachers. Looking under the hood, what you see is the Black teachers are teaching the neediest kids, and lo and behold, it's hard. Right.
It's not only hard, but their observation scores are reflecting the differences in the composition of their classroom. Right. And so what are the implications of this? The implications, right, are wide in the sense that, first, evaluation systems reward and also punish teachers based on their performance, increasingly so.
And a little bit just like, that's some of the fear about the value-added system, right?
Right.
Value-added test scores.
Though the value-added measures do control for these classroom factors. And that's the thing that's really, I think, an important point here, and a sort of subtle but important point, is that a lot of attention in the policy discussion around teacher evaluations is focused on the use of student test scores. But the fact is that those test score based measures of teacher performance account for these classroom and school factors that are unaccounted for in observation scores. And so what we show in our paper and my work is that if we were to, in the same way that we do for student test scores, account for student and school and classroom characteristics in the construction of teachers' observation scores, we would have the distribution of teacher effectiveness based on those observation scores would be the same for Black and white teachers.
Which is where it should be intuitively, right? So that then has implications. So because what are we using these teacher evaluations for? We're using them, and we're actually working in Virginia now on thinking about redoing how we do teacher evaluation in Virginia. You came and spoke with one of your Mason colleagues to our Board of Education in the fall as we're thinking about rewriting how we do teacher evaluation in Virginia. But the concept of what teacher evaluation should be doing is it should be mostly a quality improvement system, so that those evaluations are used to help identify strengths and weaknesses that can then tie into professional development and help all teachers improve, but also to help weed out those for whom it's just not a right match.
So there's an accountability function. Exactly.
And maybe raise up those who are doing extraordinary work so that we can figure out how to share their talents with
Yeah.
others. If you have an evaluation system that's fundamentally not working because of being skewed, as you've
Right.
said, then it doesn't serve those
It calls into
purposes.
question the fairness of the system, right? So for example,
Fairness and the efficacy.
exactly.
It's both unfair, but it also doesn't get the job done.
Right. So like in the context of DC has an evaluation system, the first district to revise its evaluation system in 09-10, it's called DC Impact.
Mhm.
Highly rated teachers in DC can receive tens of thousands of dollars in
Got money on it.
bonuses,
Right.
that permanently increase their
Right.
salaries.
Right.
So there's real stakes here in terms of the economic implications for teachers. But if, again, the overwhelming share of a teacher's evaluation rating is based on observation scores,
Yeah.
and we don't adjust those observation
Right.
scores for these contextual factors that matter in terms of differentiating teacher performance, then we're more likely to reward teachers who are teaching in schools and in classrooms that are serving more advantaged kids.
Yeah. Now, in fairness, the DC Impact, at least at one of its iterations, and it's gone through some changes, but it also rewards teachers explicitly who are willing to go to and do go to the hard to serve schools.
That's
right.
right. So there
that
is,
balances it out a little
well,
bit.
there's right. So there's some, what we call compensating differentials for teachers who are,
Mhm.
willing to teach in, more difficult school settings, right? But again, when we're evaluating teachers and making, high stakes decisions around compensation based on these scores, but the scores themselves are reflecting things other than the performance of the teachers to some extent, not to an to an extent, but not entirely, that we run the risk of, again, misattributing teacher effectiveness and therefore misidentifying those teachers who should be rewarded for their performance.
So I've got a couple more things I
Yeah.
want to ask you about your research, and then
Yeah.
audience, I'm going to go to you. And Paul's giving me the signal. He's got some questions
Great.
from audience. Great. So one question is, so what do we do about this? So now with your research, what would you ideally have policymakers do? How does your research help figure out, help inform policymakers and how to fix this?
It's a great question. So I've been working with policymakers in places like Chicago and Pennsylvania and other districts, and talking through my own work as well to say, look, we can make relatively simple, straightforward statistical adjustments to classroom observation scores, right? To more fairly and equitably rate teachers, right? So that we don't penalize teachers based on the school settings in which they teach, in the classrooms that they teach. So there are very specific things that we can do. Again, these systems, districts and states, are already constructing value-added scores, making similar statistical adjustments using student test scores that could be very easily done in the context of these classroom observations. So again, policy changes.
So again, if you're serving the hardest to serve students and getting some success with them, as well, maybe success suggests the test score. So I'll rephrase that. But if you're serving hard to serve students and your observations are coming out okay,
right?
You're one of the observation factors, I'm sure, is classroom management.
Exactly.
Kind of skill.
That is one of the
if
key
you're
domains.
If you're managing pretty darn well, but not perfectly in classroom management, in a class where you've got students who have just got very significant behavior problems, for instance, walking in the door, then your score essentially should be bumped up in some statistical fashion.
Right. It accounts for the fact that the scores themselves are picking up differences in teacher performance that have nothing to do with teachers themselves.
And don't I remember you saying also that one way to look at it is to look at within school differentials? Tell us about that.
Yep. So the key factor that explains differences in teacher performance on these classroom observations by race is school context, right? So about 80 to 85% of the differences have to do with things at the school building level that differ across schools. So you can imagine things like instructional leadership from administration, peer support, right? The culture of instruction, all the things that are happening in the school that are related both to teacher performance and also or teachers' instructional performance, and then ultimately their evaluation ratings. So what we argue is that we can, again, make these simple statistical controls that effectively restricts comparisons of teacher performance to teachers in the same schools.
So we say, instead of comparing how Mr. Jones is doing compared to teachers all across Chicago, how's he doing relative to other teachers within his school?
That's
building?
exactly
Yeah,
right.
yeah, and that both addresses the fairness and the efficacy.
Exactly.
And it's not that complicated to do statistically.
Straightforward.
You have to be you have to be willing to
if you take an
engage
intro
a little
stats
bit.
course here at
Okay.
Char,
Okay, good.
you would have the skills,
necessary
an
to do it.
intro regression course to,
Yeah.
to really figure out how to do
And
this
if you're
work.
running Chicago Public Schools and you haven't taken that course, you can get you or somebody like you
Right.
or a Mason
Exactly.
MPP grad to help you do it.
Yes.
Gotcha. Good, good. Well, the last question I was going to ask, and I'll just very brief, is there anything about the method of your research that you can help us lay people understand? And because I still count myself there, that would be interesting to us. Was there anything, what did you add methodologically when you were doing this research coming from this your background as an economist?
Yeah, I mean, so I use econometric tools, which, statistics and regression analysis to answer the questions. But I think, the key, and this is what I tell all of my students, and is that it's the research question that drives the choice of methods. So, we could have asked the question, why are teachers rated differently in schools, right? But that's fundamentally a qualitative question. We'd have to ask principals, and that's important work. The question that we asked was, what are the factors that are explaining it? So that really informs the choice of statistical methods, in terms of understanding, what those factors might be.
And the research you do is mostly obviously using these tools that you have been trained on as an economist to add. And I just love the fact that you're doing really hard science in this mushy area where we don't always have it. So there's lots of different kinds of research that can be useful in this field, but to bring your econometric background to doing the really rigorous data analysis in this field is really doing great things.
And the good news is
the field benefits.
And the good news is we have more than just me here at Mason doing that kind of work.
Yes,
Yep.
right,
Yep.
right. We can talk about some of
Sure.
our colleagues down the
Yep.
line if we run into time for that. But okay, Paul, you got some questions for us?
We got one question so far. It's from
Good.
Kinley. And Kinley says, you mentioned studies about Black students having a teacher who is Black and how that can help create better outcomes. Do you know if there are similar studies or similar study results for the Latinx community?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we look, we have Hispanic teachers in our data in Chicago. We don't see a gap in performance between Hispanic and white teachers, not nearly in the magnitude that we see in Chicago for Black teachers. Yeah. Yeah.
So, but I think the question was not just about your research, teacher observation, but going back to in the classroom, talking about what an impact it makes on African American students to have
that's a good
a
question.
teacher,
Yep.
a same race teacher, especially in the early grades. Do we know that on Latinx students as well?
I have not seen any work that's focused on the racial or ethnic match between Hispanic teachers and Hispanic students.
So
It's largely on
somebody
right.
needs to research
Yeah.
that, right? That's the next
Yeah.
research project. That would be interesting to look at.
Yeah.
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 I will say that I think I'm right that I've seen research that says the benefit of having teachers of color in the school building is not just to the students of color, it's to the whole community.
Yeah.
In different ways. But certainly most particularly to the students
That's
of
right.
color.
That's right.
But so I always think of that research as being students of color, and I don't know whether it's primarily African American.
It is
or whether it includes.
Yeah,
okay.
it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Other, okay. Well, we'll mosey along into some other questions, but no, I've got more from the audience. So good.
Yes, one just came in. This is from Tammy. Tammy asks, how does the research you do help facilitate changes to the law to adjust these teacher observation measurements?
It's a great question. So the law, I think really what we're referring to here is the policy itself. And those are the conversations that I and other researchers are having with policymakers at state and local levels, right? Is the extent to which we can make refinements to these evaluation systems, right? To again, more equitably and fairly rate teachers. We're trying to get some traction on this. But again, changes to policy takes time, unfortunately.
Well, and I'll chime in on that one.
Right,
Just
as
to
you
say,
know better than most.
Well, and that, there is, just like we've got a teacher race gap, there's a policy to research to policy
Yeah,
practitioner gap for sure. And I'm sure this is true in every field, but I tell my students, I always make my students, among other things, write short. For a lot of academic purposes, you write long. For policy brief purposes, I make my students write what I would like to have received as Secretary of Ed, and pretty much insisted on receiving, 3 to 5 pages is kind of generous, frankly. There's a lot in the policy world where it's really 1 pagers. Anybody who does any kind of lobbying to a legislators being generalists and fast paced, having to move from topic to topic. The rule is always 1 page front and back at most with pictures, right? So I make my students write short, partly because nobody has time to read it all. And the way I justify that to my students, I say, when I was Secretary of Education, people would send me or bring me research studies all the time they thought was relevant to my work. And I would go, oh, that's so interesting. I'm going to read it. And I would put it on a stack. And during my time, my 3 years there, that stack got taller and taller, and I never read a single one of them. It's actually one of the things I'm loving about being on faculty now, is I actually do have time to read those things. But it means that we do need to work on our mechanisms for how we communicate and translate from the research world to the policy world and back. So how do we help researchers know what questions matter to policymakers, and how do we help policymakers know what's there? And so that is something we're doing here at Mason with our Ed Policy Forward Center on education policy, trying to figure out how to bridge that gap, trying to do both writing things, and there are some there's some think tanks that try to translate work into the bites that are the right size, but we also do things like you and your colleague Seth Hunter coming to speak to the Board of Education as we're working on teacher evaluation. You want to talk a little bit more about Ed Policy Forward and what we're doing with it?
Yeah, unless there are any questions. Oh, please.
We'll do that, and then we'll do the questions.
Okay, so I'll talk.
Just brief.
So really, Ed Policy Forward predates my arrival 2.5 years ago, and you rebranded and really jump-started Ed Policy Forward before my arrival. And what I've tried to do, so Ed Policy Forward is our Ed Policy Research Center. It's a collection of affiliated faculty who are doing work on education policy related topics, right? We have researchers, we have school practitioners, school leaders, former principals in places like Fairfax County and elsewhere, who contribute to the intellectual vitality of the work that we're doing, understanding the core problems around accountability, equity in education that we're facing, and really informing the work that the scholars and the researchers are doing. And then again, interfacing with you and other policymakers in the way that you described, which is presenting to the Board of Education on the system redesign of evaluation, for example, and really trying to provide the empirical and research basis on which policymakers can make informed policy decisions.
And we're working on all kinds of ways of trying to figure out how to strengthen those connections. For instance, in addition to your work with the Board of Ed, some of your colleagues have gone to the Board of Ed to say, what are your questions? And to the State Department of Education, what are the questions you want answered, and how can we figure out? In fact, I know you're engaged with Chicago, the Chicago Research Consortium, which Chicago Education Research Consortium, is that what it's called?
The Chicago Consortium.
And the whole point of that is to make sure the researchers know what the policymakers' questions are and can figure out how to get timely answers. So. All right, Paul, what you got for us?
All right, we've got, what does equitable measurement look like, and how do you think it'll change the teaching field?
Equitable measurement. Okay.
Yes.
So when we, in the context of evaluation, we think about equitable measurement as the measures of teacher performance, whether they're based on student test scores or administrator evaluation of teacher practice, reflect a teacher's performance, right? So it's equitable in the sense that if our measures capture differences in teacher performance, then we're able to differentiate teachers in terms of their instructional effectiveness. Now, the concern, as we've been discussing, is when those measures pick up things that have nothing to do with the instruction itself, but rather the context or the characteristics of a teacher's classroom and students. So, yeah,
So if that's not what, if that's not the question you were asking, help us understand, refine your question, if we need it. So, but that equity leads me to another question I wanted to ask you, talking about the broader context of equity in education. What do you think some of the barriers are for students of color and students from low socioeconomic, low economic backgrounds? What are some of the barriers, and what does the research tell us that will help inform policymakers more broadly?
Yeah, so there's a resource issue here, but I also want to bring up an important point, because I think too often in the conversations about the role of education in society, too much burden is placed on schools to fix societal problems. And let me just put a finer point on that. And this work goes back to, the work of Jim Coleman in 1966, equal opportunity studies, following on Lyndon Johnson's legislation, the Great Society legislation. And that study going back to 66, as well as work that's been replicated to this day, shows that only about 20% of the differences in student outcomes are attributable to what happens in schools. So if we recognize that fact and do not fix things like providing equitable housing, right, providing job training and job opportunities for economically disadvantaged communities, then we only have 20% of the differences that we can really fix from the school side.
We're trying to get schools to fix poverty, basically,
Right.
instead of fixing poverty.
And that doesn't mean that educational opportunities can't be a way out of poverty, but
Right.
new work out of Harvard, Raj Chetty's work, shows that in fact, in the last 30 to 40 years, social mobility across the income distribution has declined.
Yeah.
Right.
That's
So,
so painful, isn't
right.
it? Right. When we think we're trying to move the needle and really we're sliding backwards. Well, and you know this, and maybe many in our class, our audience know this, but there's kind of been, since Coleman's work forward, there's been this sort of almost battle between those who think what we should do is fix things in the schools, and what we should fix things, focus on fixing things in the schools, and then folks who say no, that doesn't matter at all. And of course the answer is both and right?
This is
that we can do things in the schools to fix and address the challenges, and we must.
Exactly.
But and it's crazy to say schools don't matter and outcomes in schools don't matter, but it's also crazy to think schools can fix.
This is such an important point,
right?
And there has been,
and there's this battle royal, when really the obvious answer is both and.
And there has been a lengthy debate in the last 40 or 50 years, though I think the empirical evidence, some of which I've contributed to, on the of whether money matters for producing student outcomes. And the evidence very clearly, I think, shows in the last number of 5, 6, 7 years, folks like Curabo Jackson at Northwestern, Rucker Johnson at UC Berkeley, and other scholars, economists and others, focused on the resource question, which is, if we increase funding and increase resources dedicated to schools, will that help improve student outcomes? Given the point that we made, which is that resources vary dramatically across schools, and certainly across schools within districts, right? And so can we raise resources and increase funding, certainly in states like Virginia, that ranks near the bottom third of all states in terms of equitable funding statewide? If we raised resources, we could benefit students in terms of their short and long-term outcomes.
Says money does matter. Money matters,
right? And I think it's,
right.
Economists who have worked on this question, the resource question, have really come to the conclusion that if we raise money, and that money, the important caveat, is spent in ways that are tied to instruction, curriculum and instruction,
effectively spent, right?
Exactly.
Right.
Then yes, we can improve student achievement. We can't eliminate race gaps in student achievement simply by raising funding, right? This gets to the point about,
well, or not if you're talking exclusively about education funding. So
exactly.
I asked my students last fall, I was teaching an undergraduate course, Politics of American Education. What do you think is the most important policy issue pending right now to help fix American education? And they guessed one thing and another. And it's terrible to ask your students trick questions where the answer is what's in my head. But anyway, I fell for that mistake. But I thought the answer was the child poverty tax credit. So something that's not in education space at all, but we had the chance to, and did as a country, cut child poverty in half for
Right,
a year.
right.
And then we stopped it. And it's very painful to me, because if we really want our kids to do better educationally, if we could cut child poverty in half, that would be, as you say, that's there's some factors external to the
Schools.
classroom.
Yeah.
But within the classroom, am I right? Well, what's the evidence about within the school building? What are the most important factors to student success?
Well, certainly teacher quality.
So teacher
right.
quality, and that comes back to teacher evaluation.
Exactly. So if you look at this 20%, right? Again, 20% of the differences in student outcomes have to do with things that happen in schools. If you cut that 20%, 8% of that 20%, 8 percentage points of that 20 percentage points are teachers.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
So almost half of.
Exactly.
Right. Gotcha.
So the
Yeah,
most important
interesting.
within school factor is teacher quality.
Yeah.
Right. But we could do other things. We could reduce class sizes, which has been shown to improve student outcomes. Right. Again, we can dedicate more funding to instructional resources. Right.
Mhm.
To help
Strong curriculum. Right,
and to
right,
support the wraparound services that are provided
right.
for students that, again, have varying educational need.
Anything more we know about teacher evaluation and its role? What's working more broadly, not
Yeah.
just in this area, but what's working more broadly, what's not, what should we do to improve?
Yeah. I mean, it won't come as any surprise.
Since you've told us that teacher quality is the most
Yeah,
important
absolutely.
thing.
I mean, it won't come as, I think, a surprise to folks that evaluation and teacher professional development that is focused on, as you mentioned, sort of meaningful conversations between administrators and teachers around areas of weakness, areas where instruction can improve, but that being ongoing, right, embedded in the content in which teachers are teaching, right, that teachers don't just see an administrator once or twice for a walk-in during an observation, that teacher and that administrator and those curriculum coaches are working with teachers on an ongoing basis, again, identifying areas for instructional improvement, right? So teachers can improve, and identifying those areas for improvement, and supporting ways in which teachers can improve through, again, ongoing professional development within the school.
But now when you say, so teacher quality matters, that one way to think about that is how do you help individual teacher quality improve? But when you think about it systemically, I think one of the changes we've seen in the profession over the last, I think, couple of decades is a change in the experience as we're dealing with teacher shortages, dealing with teacher retention issues in particular. Our teacher workforce is more and more inexperienced, right? So we've got more and more new teachers. How do policymakers affect outcomes like that?
So, right. So, if we think about ways in which providing, early career support for teachers, again, one of the key issues is around embedded instructional coaching and support, right? I'm working with an organization called Leading Educators that provides teacher professional development, teacher coaching, teacher training in urban districts, and doing it in, again, a content specific way, focused on identifying areas of improvement, but supporting teachers in their professional development. And that can have real meaningful effects on student outcomes.
And research shows
Yes.
it actually worked.
Yes.
And as I say, especially in this environment where the teacher workforce is, I think I'm right, I don't know if it's right to say younger, but less and less experienced, where so many teachers are well, we have such big teacher turnover. That's one of the big contributors to teacher shortages, is the teacher turnovers. And the teacher, if you can boost support for those early experience years, then number one, teachers don't get pushed out, and number two, they don't opt out.
Yep. And teacher turnover is costly. It's costly to student achievement.
Yeah.
And it's also fiscally costly, about $10,000 on average to replace every teacher that leaves.
Right. Some of the school divisions, I just care passionately about some of our school divisions in Virginia I've worked with that are very high poverty, very challenged in all the ways you would expect for a high poverty community. They have less resources and students with more needs. And one of the places where those two intersect is in hiring teachers. And they usually have to hire provisional licensees, which in Virginia means teachers that haven't been through a full teacher preparation program and are kind of getting their training on the job, so to speak. and they hire people in off the street, so to speak, with good intentions, and they put them through the provisional licensing programming for 3 years.
Yeah.
And then they leave.
Yeah.
And they either leave the profession or they go to better paying jobs in
Yeah.
other less stressful divisions. But it means they've constantly got their kids facing inexperienced teachers. And I remember a Board of Ed moment when we were looking at, how come we can't get the kids to pass algebra in such and such a school division? And the simple answer came back, well, basically we have no algebra teachers.
Mhm.
All of our algebra classes are
Yep.
being taught by fill-in subs because we have literally nobody qualified to teach in front of the room. So those are really policy challenges that can't be fixed completely at the individual.
Yeah. And
school
those challenges,
level.
as you know, are concentrated in some of our most economically
Yeah.
disadvantaged
Yeah.
schools. Yeah.
Paul, you got us some questions. Good.
Yes. So going back to some of your research, you said you mentioned research in Chicago. Does your research expand beyond that area or beyond Chicago to other areas of the US? And how do they reflect the overall picture of the current status of teaching?
Well, and your research is beyond just, you bring your economists' rigorous research tools to fields, not just teaching professions. So tell us about some of your research in other parts of the country as well as answering that second part.
Yeah. So I've got work in Pennsylvania. I've been working in Pennsylvania for over a decade and have a new paper that shows that providing intensive induction and support for early career principals, right? So providing principals with the type of ongoing sustained professional development early in their careers can have downstream and direct effects on teacher effectiveness, right? So again, if we provide supports for training principals to work with teachers to identify areas for instructional improvement and the like, we can also drive improvements in teacher effectiveness and ultimately student achievement. So again, in places like Pennsylvania, focusing on the human capital of educators, not just teachers, but also administrators.
You've also done work in Pennsylvania on resource allocation. Can you explain that in a way we might understand it?
Yeah, so I've done work in, as Ann says, in school finance and school finance reform. So in places like Pennsylvania that have revised their school finance system, as many of you might know, there are 50 state school finance systems. Each state has its own way of collecting, allocating, and distributing funds to their schools.
And they are extremely complex.
Very complex and very different in a lot of ways. In their progressivity in terms of providing more or less money to schools serving more or less poor kids. But in places that, in places like Pennsylvania and other states that provide more support, more funding for the most economically disadvantaged kids, we can actually generate improvements in student outcomes, right? So again, my work covers
And
not
that's
just
some of what you've been able to demonstrate with your research.
Yeah, but the money, it needs to be sufficient, right? So in Pennsylvania, for example, we show that their statewide finance reform in 2008-9, which raised very little additional money for schools, had no effect on student performance because the money was just not sufficient, right? So we not only need to have the will, we need to have the capacity in order to support the types of resource allocations that are necessary to drive improvements. Yeah.
You said something about Virginia earlier. I wanted to go back and clarify or ask you to clarify. So Virginia's expenditures on K-12 are low, but it's also the case that we have
Unequal.
Tell us more about that.
Yeah, and also Virginia is at really the bottom of the pack in terms of teacher salaries also, right? So it's not just on the school funding side, it's on the teacher salary side as well, which again is linked up very, to school funding. But on average, Virginia is relatively low compared to other states in terms of the average per pupil allocations. But importantly, it lacks progressivity, meaning that our poorest schools in Virginia do much worse relative to the wealthier schools in Virginia than in other states.
So one of your colleagues, I think it's somebody, well, you'll remember somebody in New Jersey, I think, but essentially ranks the states by their
Bruce Baker,
how inequitable our
Yes.
funding is, comparing the average per student allocation of the poorest quintile to the wealthiest quintile, something like that.
That's
How big
exactly
is the
right.
gap?
Yes.
And Virginia scores poorly on that.
It does very poorly.
Yeah, which
right.
is so, and Virginia does value education, we say we value education. I think we truly do, but our funding mechanisms have
Right.
not we haven't gone through a major education finance reform in many years. And,
Yeah.
and I guess we need to.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Unfortunately, the Board of Ed that I sit on, we don't control that. That's the legislature.
Yes, all right, so we have a question from Madison. Why do you think, why do you all think education policy isn't discussed more or frequently, or isn't a main policy issue during national political campaigns?
Yeah, so I'm going to jump in on this
Please.
one because, and you may
No, please.
as well, but I am just amazed at how little attention until the last year or so it's gotten, because education is absolutely the top. It is either the top or the next to top budget line in every state and local government. And folks worry a lot and think a lot about what legislatures do in terms of passing laws, but really the most important thing that the legislatures and the executive branch, that all our elected officials do from school board on up, is allocate resources, right? Money, follow the money, is what matters in so many areas. And the fact that we are spending so much money, whether well or not, and whether it's enough or not, but just the sheer volume, because we got so many kids and therefore so many teachers, the sheer volume of funds passing through. I used to work in foster care reform. Well, foster care is this tiny, bitty little piece. And one good thing about that, it means you can make changes fairly easily that have big impacts. But in education, it's hard. You want to raise teacher pay. Well, you got 100,000 teachers in a state the size of Virginia. So there's not any tinkering solutions often. But all that it says, to me, it seems like it should be a very, very top issue. One reason it maybe doesn't get as much attention at the national level is that education really has been more funded and more managed at both the state and the local level than at the national level. Now, we did go through a period with President Bush's No Child Left Behind and President Obama's Race to the Top, et cetera, where there was more discussion at the national level, but still nowhere near enough relative to the importance.
Yeah.
And at the federal level, the amount of money that's involved in K-12 education especially is small compared to so many other things the federal government is doing. So there may be some sense, but to me, it makes perfect sense. And so therefore, we ought to be talking about it more. And then we did in 2021 in the Virginia gubernatorial election, but we talked about all the wrong things instead of talking about things that matter, like teacher pay and resource allocation. We got distracted, let's just say.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to know, right, that the 14th Amendment, there's nothing in the Constitution that requires the federal government to actually provide education. It's local, right? So it devolves educational administration to the state and local level, of which 90% of school funding comes from state and local resources. So it makes, and again, we've got effectively 50 different school funding systems, right?
But that there is a national imperative, and it did, going back to President Kennedy saying we're going to put a man on the moon, et cetera, that there is this sort of sense of education mattering to workforce, and I think it does. And workforce and education mattering to our international competitiveness. And the United States, we always think we're the best at everything, but we don't actually compare all that
Not particularly well
on all kinds of education outcome measures to much of to who we think of as our
compared to
peers.
other developed countries. We're in the low 20s
Yeah.
in international math and reading, international math and English.
Low
exams.
20s meaning more. Tell us more. what you mean.
25th, 26 out of
Percentile? No.
count.
Oh, okay.
So the number,
Gotcha.
the ranking out of
Yes.
of
So
all
we've got
developed-
20 some countries that are better than us
Right.
on math, basic math and literacy.
That's right. Yeah.
And there, that's a whole nother, we could have
Yeah.
another whole hour-long conversation about that and what are the factors that go into it. But to the questioner's
Yes.
point, it is a little shocking sometimes that we don't have more national attention to it. Yeah. But I will say, I had a colleague here at Mason for a while who, when I first came to Mason, a colleague who had come here, me coming straight from the Virginia Secretary of Education role, he came from the Obama administration's U.S. Department of Education. And so when we came to every policy question, he would see a federal solution and I would see a state solution. And I will say, you take what you bring to it, but mostly I'm happy that the feds ought to send us money and stay out of it. Give us some overall transparency about outcome requirements, but then look to the states one of the best things I think that No Child Left Behind did. I'd be interested to hear you on this, but I think one of the best things they did was help us have uniform measures of graduation, which we didn't for many years. Everybody's definition, what's a graduation rate? It was all over the map. And, basically people could fudge the numbers. So now we have a pretty uniform system of measuring graduation rates. So the governor of Virginia and the governor of Mississippi can look at their numbers and go, oh, no, I'm not doing well compared to my peers. What can I do about it?
Yeah. And again, instantiating, state standards and tests mapped onto those standards is a way of, again, this gets to one of the questions, measuring, in this case, not teacher performance, but student performance, is a way of at least identifying places where gaps may exist.
Well, we're almost time's up. I want to talk just a little bit about some of our education policy programs here, but if we have one more quick question, we'll squeeze one in and then wrap up.
And it's a follow-up to that last question.
Great.
So, we talked about how it's not a big topic in national political campaigns, and this person asks, how can we make it more of a topic? What can we do to make it a more poignant point?
Well, that's a great question. And I think some of what may be happening, at least in Virginia, and I hope nationally in response to this, some of the conversations of the last year, we've been hearing from what I think are a small number of parents who are fixed on some particular issues that I don't think are the key issues in terms of what's going to make students more successful.
Okay.
Whereas I think there are the grand majority of parents, and in fact, I think local teachers as their partners and their allies. And I'm hoping that I think it does have to come from parents and teachers, but really primarily from parents, to raise up the issues that we need to be supporting our teachers and our schools more effectively, and be asking those questions of elected officials at all levels. And I will say, I actually still think that the most important elected office in the land is school boards. So, and the good thing about that is they are local. So it means that if you're looking for ways to get involved, it's very up close and personal, and people can jump in and make a difference. Anything to add on that?
Yeah.
All right, well, then let's just take just a minute to say,
Great. Yeah.
we've talked a little bit about ed policy forward, but there are a number of ways to study education policy at Mason with Matthew and me and our really phenomenal colleagues. One of them is through the MPP program here at the Schar School, where we sit at the moment. The Schar School offers a number of terrific policy degrees, but the largest, I think, program is the Masters of Public Policy.
Yeah.
And within that, one can concentrate on different topics. We call them emphasis areas here, rather than formal concentrations. But one of the emphasis areas within the MPP program is education policy. And so one applies to the Schar School MPP program. And once here, you take your core courses with all the MPP students, and you take elective courses in education policy with Matthew and me and other education policy colleagues. Another way that can run, it can be complementary to that, is we have a certificate program at the Ed School where you take a series of 5 courses in education policy and you get a postgraduate certificate in education policy. If you do the MPP program, you can essentially walk away with both of those, 2 for the price of 1, if you complete those ed policy certificate courses as part of your MPP elective courses. And then finally, we have some really strong doctoral program. If you want to delve in deeper into actually producing the research of the top quality that Matthew has been talking about today, qualitative and quantitative research, we have really terrific options in our doctoral programs at the College of Education and Human Development. Information about all of those is on our ed policy website, which Paul is going to put on in the chat. And you're also going to put my email and Matthew's and the MPP program information here at Schar there. Is that right?
Yeah, all there. Yeah.
So feel free, if there's anything we haven't
Yep.
talked about, either
Please.
substantively or about ways to get involved here at George Mason, Mason is celebrating our 50th anniversary, which makes us a relatively young
Yes.
university, but there's lots of exciting stuff going on here, and we'd love to have you join us.
Thanks.
Matthew, any
No,
final
no,
words?
thanks for joining us today. And as Ann said, we welcome feedback. And if you're interested, please reach out to us directly. Yeah. Thanks, Ann.
Great.